Oh boy, how do booktubers do this? Please don't fall. Can we believe that a quarter of the year is already over? How did this happen? 2021 and the first quarter is already over. I can't really believe it. It's pretty amazing. Today we're here for a mostly March wrap up. I didn't read anything in January. I just started a book in January, but I never finished it. But I did finish 2 books in February and I think 9 in March. I'm not exactly sure. I don't think I've ever read this many books in a month, ever since I graduated from high school maybe, and that summer where we had nothing to do. Maybe I read that much back then, but I truly cannot remember the last time I read this much. But I did change a few things in how I plan to read and how I approached actual reading and how I prioritized it. So if you are interested in knowing how I increased my reading, let me know. I can do a whole video on it, but we'll see how I keep up and if I can keep up in April. Let's talk about the 2 books I finished in February, and one of them was Native American DNA. This is a nonfiction book and it's more difficult to get through, so it's not light reading, I would say. It actually reads more like a longer dissertation. Kim Tallbear is the author of this book and she is an anthropologist, and a lot of her work circles around Native American DNA and using DNA as a heritage test, because we have these DNA heritage tests online everywhere and everyone gets so excited about, oh my god, I'm Native American, oh my god, I'm this, I find this in my DNA. And she talks a lot about the issues around genealogy tests and DNA heritage tests, and this book is a whole more academic discussion on the topic. I found it very accessible, although a lot of people, when I did read the reviews, did not think it was very accessible. I think it is. If you're used to reading papers and you're used to reading academically for school, this probably is more accessible. If you're not used to that, then plan for more time, but it's still an absolutely manageable book and very interesting to go through. So I actually picked a seminar this semester just to push myself to actually read this. So I did a seminar on anti-discrimination, and I talked about DNA heritage test and the more scientific side of that because I study molecular biotechnology in grad school. So in my presentation where I read this book, I also talked a lot about what natural sciences do and how they affect the way we think about things. So that was actually a very interesting read. Very highly recommend, and I gave this 5 out of 5 stars. Not the most relaxing read, but still very interesting. The other book that I read in February was Girl, a Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And this was an amazing read. This was actually, I think this was kind of the book that got me back into reading. It is about several different women and how their lives are connected. I just love the way this was done. This was written in more of a prose style, I guess, but it was written so nicely and so beautifully, and it's about all these different women and their lives, how they led up to the situation that they're in, how it led to them being the person that they are, and how they were connected in several different ways. This also focuses on Black women living mostly in London, so this is an UK-based book. Yeah, so big recommendation, 5 out of 5 stars for anyone looking for something more emotional, more character-based, not necessarily plot-based. Great book. The next book that I read, I don't have the physical copy right here because I lent it to my mom, so that was The Vanishing Half. A lot of people probably have heard of this, and I put off reading The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett for so long, and I finally sat down and I was finally like, you know what, I want to read this book. Everyone says it's a great book, and I completely agree. It is a wonderful book, so 5 out of 5 for The Vanishing Half. This story is about twins, so 2 twin girls, and they are Black, but they are white passing, or they could be white passing. And what happens is that they eventually leave the town that they're from, and then they split, their lives split, and one of the twin sisters uses the fact that she is white passing and tries to have basically a white life, and the other sister remains in the Black world and also marries a very Black man, so her daughter is also very visibly Black. And it talks about the way their lives unfold and the way they seem the way they see the same events, and also the ripple effect of decisions that you made at a young age. And it's Also not a very plot-heavy book and more of a character-based book, but I absolutely love books like that, and it was just written so nicely, and I also loved the fact that it was about the people around them too. So we learn about their partners, about their daughters, we learn about their families and how their relationships with these people unfold. So I really truly recommend everyone read this book. There's nothing much I can add to the discussion because I do think it is just as great as everyone says. So 5 out of 5, we'll leave it there. The next book that I read, I actually half read, half listened to. This book is actually a German book. Surprise! It's called Alta Samana and it's by Sophie Passmann. Sophie Passmann is known in Germany as she's a feminist, and she calls herself a Twitter feminist, so she also lives off of social media or has a big following on social media about feminism mostly. And in this book, she, so translated, this means old white men, and she took a whole summer off and interviewed old white men and talked to them about the world and feminism and how they see things. And I loved the idea of this book very much, but I didn't think this book was something super insightful, so I gave it 3.5 out of 5 stars because I love the idea, and I also think that she did a really good job in the interviews. So it was certainly an interesting read, and if you have the spare time and that's interesting to you, sure, give it a read, but I don't think it was very groundbreaking. But I am very excited for her second book because I think when she wrote this, she was in her early 20s, and I think the next few books that Sophie Passmann will write are probably going to be a lot better and a lot more insightful. So I'm very excited for the next few books. So the next book I read was Red, White, and Royal Blue, and this was just a fun read. There's nothing really much to say. I think I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. It's a romance novel, and it is about the president's son from the US and the Prince of England kind of falling for each other, maybe having a thing. And it's also about the political climate around that, like what that would look like if actually a son of a president and a Prince of England were gay and how that evolved. But what was very interesting while reading this, that was the same time Meghan and Prince Harry had their interview with Oprah. That was pretty interesting because I was just in the middle of this book, and the prince in this book also has a lot of issues with his family and the queen and his father and brother and so forth. And it was really interesting to hear about Harry and Meghan at the same time that I was reading this book, because a lot of these things that happen in here now, I feel like that would never happen. I do not have enough trust in the royal family for them to be as progressive as this. Because I enjoyed The Vanishing Half so much, I really enjoyed the book. After I read these, I was like, oh crap, I think I already read all the fiction I have at home. So I purchased The Mothers by Brit Bennett, which is the same author as The Vanishing Half. This is her first book. I think this was her debut novel. Brit Bennett just has an absolute knack for writing characters that seem so real, and they just really feel like normal people that you could meet in your life, and it's just fascinating. The character development is amazing. So the idea behind this book is that a girl in her teens gets pregnant and she does not have the baby, she has an abortion, and she lets the guy that got her pregnant know, and in the same summer she befriends another girl from her class, but she's about to go off to college, and then it becomes a threesome situation. Well, not a real threesome, but it becomes like a love triangle. And we see this love triangle develop throughout their whole lives. So we see how this one summer where she has an abortion, we see how that decision ripples through their whole lives. And it's also not very plot-based, it's more character-driven, and it's just amazing how much it shows, the ripple effect of life, of decisions you make as a younger self and how they will change the trajectory of your whole life. I just love the style of this book, and I guess what I could say about Brit Bennett, it's like when you're reading, you feel like you're watching a movie. I don't know how to describe that. I mean, of course, it's something that's happening in your head. It's always going to be like a movie in your head. But some writers it truly feels like you're watching a movie and not reading a book. And that's how I feel about Brit Bennett, and that's how I feel about The Mothers and the Vanishing Half. Have I talked enough about this book? Yes. The next book on the list was The Power by Naomi Alderman, and I think a lot of you have probably heard about this book. This was like Book of the Year, Women's Prize for Fiction 2017. I heard a lot about this book and I finally just got to it and figured I should check it out. Now, a lot of these books that I read before were very character driven, and this was definitely very plot driven, so a lot happens in this book. The basic idea behind this book is that women suddenly, and women in our time, so basically around 2017, now 2020 also, developed this power, like electricity power, and they all of a sudden, women are a lot stronger than men, because obviously with this electricity, women can hurt men and kill them like in an instant with this power. What we see is basically the slow shift from a patriarchal society to a matriarchal society, or at least we see the original conflict between the two, because now we have the old patriarchs that want to keep men in power, but all of a sudden now women are super dangerous and women are rising up against all of the oppression that they've had over the years and are now trying to overpower men. And the other interesting framing of the story is that it's basically historical fiction. So the story that we read is something that someone like in 5,000 years wrote about our time in a fictional sense. So basically, like the Underground Railroad in our time is like fiction about a few hundred years before us. And this is basically, this story is historical fiction. And so at the very end, we also get letters between the people that are discussing the story idea. And from those letters, we learn that there has since been a matriarchal society. And basically everything we say about men now is now about women. So women are the bosses, there's a glass ceiling for men, and so forth. So everything completely turns around. And I had a few mixed feelings about this book. And it was really hard for me to pinpoint it. It took me a while. So what I did like is the absolute reflection or the turnaround of all the things. So suddenly, boys can't go out at night. Suddenly they're scared of women. Suddenly there's all these issues that we as women do have every day, basically, because I don't go out when it's dark, especially not at night, and now all of a sudden men can't go out at night when it's dark. The other thing that this did really well in my opinion was the conspiracy theorists, especially reading this in a pandemic and reading this in a time where there are so many conspiracy theories out there. I mean, we won't even get into that. I thought that was also on point in this book, so you really saw a lot of these conspiracy theories growing and see them distributing throughout the world, and I thought that was also very much on point. But I didn't really like the ending that much. I feel like there was a lot of build-up, and then that build-up wasn't really resolved for me, at least as a reader. I also read a lot online that this is like the epitome of white feminism. And I'm also trying to learn more about being more inclusive in my feminism, because I'd say I'm a feminist, and I think there's a lot to learn out there about what feminism means to include every single person. I do want to listen, and it does feel like something is missing. It's like it's too easy. It's like the plot feels too easy and the issues feel too easy. I can't really put my finger on it, but something about it just kind of bothered me. So I give this a 4 out of 5 because I love the idea, and I thought some things were done really, really well. But I'm also really excited to hear about different opinions on this book. So please let me know in the comments, because something about this just didn't feel quite right. The next book that I finished in March, I started it in January, I finished it in March, was A Promised Land by Barack Obama. And oh, was this a baby. It took me a while to read this, obviously. I still kind of don't know what to rate this book. I think I would give it a 4 out of 5 or a 5 out of 5. This is obviously Barack Obama's memoir of pretty much the first term of him as a president. And there's going to be a second book, there's going to be a second memoir, which will probably be more about his second term. When he was elected, I was a teen. So I was pretty much a teenager when he was elected the first time, and the first time I ever got to vote was for his second term. So that was the first time I ever voted in my life. I think I was 18 then, pretty much. It was a good lesson on everything that I was hearing back then, because I remember the financial crisis, obviously, I remember the repercussions, But for us in Germany, it wasn't as bad as it was in the States. We had everything going on with Greece and... Okay, I'm not going to go into this. But anyway, it was interesting to see the American perspective of things because I only remember, of course, the German media reporting on all of this stuff. And this was an American perspective on everything that happened, basically. And because Europeans and Americans do have a lot of like philosophical differences on like how you handle economy, for example, it was really interesting to hear the American narrative. So from that perspective, this was super interesting. The other thing that I really liked was him showing like the foreboding of what a big role media would play later on, especially in later presidential campaigns. There was a lot of foreboding of certain movements that I back then definitely didn't see because I was just too young. It's just as simple as that. And so that was a really interesting analytical standpoint, but it was very detailed. There were several parts where I was just speed reading instead of normal reading, I guess, because it was just a little too much. Because some topics just weren't as interesting to me, and I didn't want to know who he talked what about exactly in which meeting. It was just a little too much for my taste. So there were some things that I didn't skip over, but that I skimmed. When this book was published, I expected it to be something like Michelle Obama's book that was very motivating and unbelievably personal and emotional. And this is certainly the more rational, detailed account of everything that happened. And I think going into the second book, there were two things I'm going to do differently. Number one, I now know my expectations, and now that I have a different expectation, I think I will enjoy the second book more. And I think I'll also listen to the second book, because I think this would be a cool book to listen to him actually narrate it. But I did read this, I did not listen to it. And yeah, I think I'll be listening to the second book of this. But still an interesting read, great read. Barack Obama is an unbelievable writer, and obviously a lot of interesting topics in this book, and still highly recommend reading it, maybe listening to it instead of reading it. Wow, we have a lot of books this month. The next book that I finished this month was Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram X. Kendi. And this is not a book that I read in March. This is a book that I've been reading for quite some time. It's a very thick book, and I am not necessarily a history buff, so this was really difficult for me to get through, but it was very necessary and a very good read. So basically this is definitely nonfiction. This is basically a history book on the racist ideas in the United States. It starts before slavery and the narratives and the racist ideas and narratives that we had back then, and goes all the way up to current times. I listened to this book actually parallel to reading it, so I listened to it and then also made some annotations throughout the books to make sure that I really understood everything, because like I said, I am not a history buff, so this was really difficult for me to get through. There's also like a teenage or young adult version of this, and I think I might also purchase that and read that also, just to make sure that it sticks, because this was just really difficult. The most interesting part of this to me personally was the 20th century, talking about the 20th century, and I think there's also a newer version that might also talk about the 21st century or further into the 21st century. I thought that was super interesting, because the narrative that I grew up with was basically, well, slavery's done and we also had the civil rights movement, so what else is there to complain about? My parents didn't say that or anything, but that was just the media narrative that I remember when I was growing up in the 90s and early 2000s. So it was really good to reflect on the 20th century and see all of the racist ideas and narratives that were still very much present in that time. So a good read. I recommend this to everyone, even Germans, even Europeans. So the next book that I read, I know I've really read a lot this month. I can't believe it, okay? I cannot believe this. The next book was Know My Name by Chanel Miller. And she is the survivor of the Stanford sexual assault case. So this is her memoir. And it's a very public, very big trial, and I remember reading her victim impact statement, so I didn't know about her trial originally. And so when I saw that she had written this, her account of everything that happened, I had to get it. Now, for one, Chanel Miller is an excellent writer. Unbelievable writer. She is so good. This is so well written. She obviously touched on a lot of different subjects because she talks about the night. Basically, this book starts on the night of her assault, and then it goes through the next 5 years. So we have all of the court hearings. We know exactly what she went through as a victim, as a survivor, and what happens to people. I mean, it was really horrible to read even the medical examinations that she had to go through after, and how invasive everything is, and how invasive it is to your privacy. And that was just really good to read, and I think that's very, very eye-opening. Now, for me personally, this was an interesting read because I, of course, was comparing it to the German court system the whole time I was reading this, especially in the sentencing part. So I know I have a lot of friends that studied law in Germany. For some reason, I just know a lot of people. And so I did actually call most of them up afterwards, and I was like, yo, I need to talk to you about this. Because what I thought was pretty fascinating was the concept of having character witnesses. And I asked my friends whether you have that in the German system as well. So in this book, the rapist, he has tons of character witnesses coming in, and of course it's going to be his parents. That kind of makes sense, but then also like his French teacher from middle school, and he obviously committed this crime when he was in college, so this was quite a bit later. And his French teacher obviously doesn't know anything about his relationships or the way he deals with women, so that's just not a good reference. And so I asked my friends what they thought if that was possible in a German system, and they said that yeah, you have character witnesses in the German system, but they're not necessarily to assess whether it's a good or a bad person. But they say sometimes they'll invite the parents to court because it's interesting to see how the parents talk about their kid. Because if their parents obviously coddled their kid or raised their kid to believe that they're so awesome and amazing that the kid could be narcissistic because of it, that's something that they want to take into account when doing the sentencing. But having like the French teacher there makes no sense at all, and they said that wouldn't hold up in a German court. They would never allow that in a German court. So I thought that was just a really interesting discussion, and I also talked to them about the sentencing, of course. Now, for context, German sentencing is a lot more lenient than American sentencing, so German prison sentences are usually not as long as American ones. Because the German system really does focus more on rehabilitation and bringing people back into society. And some of them did say that yes, they can understand the reasoning behind the sentence. However, and this is kind of what was completely forgotten in her case, was to see how much it impacted the victim's life. Because a lot of my friends said, yeah, of course they're going to take into account if this person's if this rapist's life is going to be completely interrupted. So if they have a good job, if they're well integrated into society, and they take them out of society for 20 years, they said, well, the chance of rehabilitating that person and actually bringing them back into society is very low because they're going to be very aggravated. So of course, they don't want to go for the harshest sentencing. But they said, of course, you have to weigh what happens to the victim on the other side. But if they know, like in Chanel's case, that there are so many issues, and that's just the way it is. It's going to be like that for everyone. Most people are going to have tons of issues and are going to have a lot of long-lasting issues because of a case like this. Then they have to take that into account as well. So that should have been part of a sentencing too. So a lot of my friends did not agree with the sentencing in this case, even for a system that has a lot more lenient sentencing. So this was a really interesting discussion with my friends to just compare the different systems, and we read up a lot about it, so that was an interesting thing. Yes, I do recommend it, 5 out of 5, absolutely. But obviously, please look up the trigger warnings for this book. Make sure that you can read this book because it's not light reading. It for sure is not light reading, and it is very triggering for some people, or might be very triggering for some people. So please make sure that you are in the right place to read this. The next book that I read was Severance by Ling Ma. I seriously don't know how I did this month, but I focused. I guess that's all we have to say. This is a dystopian novel. I am a big fan of dystopian novels and post-apocalyptic stories. Absolutely my thing. So much my thing. Severance was a very interesting read. It is about a pandemic. So the premise of this is we are following a character. She has her job, she has her office job, her life is pretty much normal. Her parents emigrated from China to the US, and she also then came to the US, I think at a very young age, and she has a pretty normal life going on, and then suddenly this pandemic hits, and they call it the Shang fever. And this fever basically turns people into like zombies, but not the bad kind of zombies, not the zombies that want to eat your flesh, but just no awareness. They don't know anything that's happening around them, and they'll live on for weeks just following all kinds of routines. Like they'll keep setting the dinner table and then sitting down and eating and then taking everything off the table and do the same thing again for just weeks on end. They turn into these like zombie people. But at the same time, and this isn't what I didn't expect from this book, this is a big reflection on like capitalism. It really is, on office jobs and capitalism. And it was interesting to see these zombies going through their routines because of this fungus that spread, and then have this reflection on what it means to work in an office and maybe have a 9 to 5 and feeling like a zombie in this world and not being able to escape fast fashion, for example, and things produced in Bangladesh and China and so forth. So that was a very weird mirroring of like the word zombie. So like what it could mean in a pandemic sense and what it could mean in our world today. And really interesting read. Was not expecting that from a pandemic book. So I really enjoyed this. Also for the reflection, for the office job and capitalism reflection, didn't expect it, but very much liked it. A favorite book of mine, 5 out of 5. Obviously it's always weird to read pandemic books when you're in a pandemic. So if I had read this like a year and 1 month ago, I would have had no idea what an N95 mask is. And it's interesting to see the CDC recommending things, recommending masks and gloves and so forth throughout this book, because there is obviously, we have a lot of feelings about that topic now, don't we? So that was an interesting read. So the last book that I listened to, did not read it, listened to it, was The Song of Achilles. What a beautiful book. Oh my gosh, just what a beautiful book. So I have since learned that this is a Greek epos, not a Greek tragedy. I have no idea what the difference is. Someone corrected me on Instagram and explained it to me, and I still didn't understand it. So the Song of Achilles is a retelling of the Iliad from a different perspective. Since I had not read the Iliad, I don't know. I never thought of reading these stories because it's always seemed so inaccessible. It's always seemed like this, I can't read that because I'm not smart enough to read that. But this was retold and rewritten beautifully and also very accessibly. This book also doesn't expect you to know all of the figures. If you're reading like Greek literature, I guess, or Greek tragedies, very often they'll mention gods or people that they expect you to know, but every person in this book is introduced, so you get a context of who that person is, and it just makes way more sense in the whole context of things. It's beautiful, there's adventure, there's romance, there's a plot that made me cry, and it was so beautifully written. So I highly recommend, and I think I'll be purchasing the hardback. I'll be purchasing a copy for myself just to support the author and also have that book in my collection. So all in all, this was a pretty good month. So a lot of these books I really enjoyed, most of the books that I read this month, and I'm really excited to see what April will bring. I have some cool to-be reads, and I'll be filming them in just a sec, so you know it will be coming. Thank you for being here, for listening to me rambling forever, because I have been rambling forever and I'm really tired now. I need something to drink. I hope you're having a good week, and I will see you soon. Oh god, don't fall, please don't. Oh, that's a workout. The other book that I read in February, the next book that I finished this month, oh my god. The next book that I finished